Culture of watching you. Everybody's welcome to Maynooth University. With a few in the room here and quite a few online, and it's great to be able to do this hybrid event. And we're continuing our research for policy series. It's myself, Seán, Foghlú, Professor Mark Boyle, and John O'Connor are jointly organising. So we are really thrilled today to be joined by, I think, two innovators in this space who have a really interesting story to tell and have been involved in some really interesting initiatives and have really thought about what works and thought about how to make a difference. And they're involved here on this, but they're also involved more widely in the national and indeed international policy engagement, research or policy engagement world. So I'm going to hand over to the two of them, Professor Brian Ó Gallachóir, who's the Associate Vice President of Sustainability at University College Cork, and also Ian Hughes, who's down as Research Officer in the Department of Education and Youth, who's also on part-time secondment to UCC, supported by the EPA. So it's great that, and that's what's really interesting about this. It's a really interesting mix of experiences. So we'll talk for a while, and then we'll open it up. So Grameen.
So thanks very much, Seán, Mark and John. We're delighted to be here. This is what we'll start with is a reflective journey, and then we'll open up. I'm very intrigued by the discussion, so we need lots of time for discussion. And we have some very informed people in the audience, so I'm really looking forward to the engagement on this. So it's a 17-year journey for me in terms of doing research and engaging with the policy system. And then we'll also include as part of that was establishing a secondment arrangement. So that's an 8-year journey. So Ian will take up halfway through the presentation to talk about that 8-year piece. And first I'll give a reflection on the 17 years and the different ways in which we've engaged with the policy system based on our research. So I'll start with the perspective of a researcher seeking to engage with the policy system, making lots of mistakes, learning a lot, and I'll frame it around these 4 areas of informing policy, underpinning policy, co-producing policy, and then building absorptive capacity in the policy system. And then Ian will talk about the poly crisis, deep societal innovation, and futures thinking. And we'll both give some reflections then at the end to essentially to open up the discussion. So to start with, so when I think back 17 years ago, I established a team in UCC with a focus on developing capacity in energy systems modelling in order to be able to explore the future of Ireland's energy system through essentially software modelling tools, and to look at the implications of different decisions we made on things like energy security, on things like emissions reduction, energy poverty, etc. And a real focus from the start was to try and make sure that in addition to doing excellent research, that we also had an impact. And the core focus of that impact was on informing policy. So then about 12 years ago, we produced this paper, published it in the Energy Policy Journal, and it was the first low-carbon energy roadmap for Ireland, with a long-term time horizon out to 2050. 2050 doesn't seem as long away now. It seemed longer away back then. And when we generated that piece of work, we wanted to see, well, how could we actually use this to inform policy? And the process that was underway at the time was essentially around the development or not of climate legislation in Ireland for the first time. So I was invited to present this work at the Oireachtas Committee meeting that was looking at the heads of bill at the time for the climate legislation. There have been previous attempts to introduce climate legislation in Ireland. And the Oireachtas Committee then produced a report, and they quoted from something that I presented, which essentially gave confidence that it was technically achievable for Ireland to meet ambitious emissions reduction scenarios. And that enabled, I suppose, confidence in the political system to legislate for climate action based on the targets that we had then in the country. And building on that, then, we started engaging with other government departments as issues arose, as policy discussions arose on different things around the evolution of the energy system, and feeding the information in to inform decisions. So things like the Department of Transport focus on smart mobility and trying to encourage people to change how they thought about journeys. They used some of our research in that and referenced it in the Your Journey Counts campaign. We also informed the Climate Action Plan, the first Climate Action Plan, which was one of the consequences of the legislation, and indeed the climate action plans that have come out annually since then. And then other aspects of policy like the hydrogen strategy. We were called on to provide some numbers to inform some of the deliberations there, Ireland's long-term strategy on greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and other aspects of policy such as energy security, in this case, Ireland's gas supply and security around that. So these were in some ways specific pieces of research that informed policy decisions at times. And it was quite a linear process. Now, moving from that to, I suppose, the difference between that and underpinning policy is around developing a team and making that information more readily available in a systematic way to the policy system. And this was highlighted by the former Secretary General of DFERIS. In terms of, and this was enabled, I mean, one thing I forgot to say is, I, as well as the Associate Vice President role in UCC, I'm also Director of the MaREI Centre. And the establishment of research centres of scale in Ireland has been a game changer and really helped enable us to move from informing to underpinning, giving that resources to be able to actually develop a persistent engagement strategy, build trust, and effectively then guide Ireland's transition to net zero, as pointed out by Jim. And one part of that was called out, and I'm delighted one of the co-authors of this report is here in the room, the Department of, as it was at the time, Environment, Climate, Communications, the Research and Innovation Strategy, called out a project, and this was a mechanism. This capacity project was one of the mechanisms established by the government department to essentially provide service provision directly to them. So, building on the modelling capacity that we had developed in UCC, the department engaged in a services level agreement with us to provide modelling to them on an ongoing basis. And this moved from that incremental piecewise to a more systematic delivery of a service from a research body to a government department. And while it was to one government department, then of course, because energy and climate policy spreads across other departments, it was made available to other government departments as well, but enabled through the DEC at the time in terms of the establishment of that arrangement, that mechanism. The next piece I want to talk about is a trickier one, because co-producing policy, with researchers and policy makers and policy practitioners and decision makers all have different roles. So co-producing can be a kind of messy business. Now, co-producing research in the context of collaborating with industry is also a messy process. And the messiness there is generally around IP and who owns it and who retains it. Co-producing with citizens and communities is also a messy process. In terms of some of the dimensions of where the research goes and how impactful it is, and how objective then the research is. There's trickiness in all these co-producing mechanisms, and the co-producing of policy falls into the same category. But from our experience, it's a hugely enriching and fulfilling process. So it's worth the struggling through the messiness to see what can be achieved. And one example is from 2015, some work we did with the Department of Climate, Energy and Environment, and it focused on the white paper on energy that was published in 2015. It was published in December, but during the summer of 2015, we spent a number of weeks doing analysis and then engaging with the civil servants. And this was as they were writing particular chapters. We go up every 2 weeks, present some analysis. It might be on energy poverty, or it might be on energy security, or it might be on renewable energy. And that was the chapter that they were focusing on at that time. And we had this interactive process where we listened and understood what the policy concerns and needs were, and were able to do analysis that effectively helped to essentially provide some insights that could guide the policymakers in writing that document. And that was a fascinating process in terms of that level of interaction and the, as I say, co-production. A second example more recently is around carbon budgets. This is a different process because in this case, the Climate Change Advisory Council was asked through the legislation to advise on carbon budgets that were to be approved by government, but then agreed by the Oireachtas. And we were involved in a committee set up by the Climate Change Advisory Council, which also involved state bodies, state agencies. And again, we had this kind of deliberation, analysis, engagement, and teasing out what made sense in the context of meeting the needs of the legislation and also meeting the goals in terms of emissions reduction ambitions. And in that one, again, I presented to an Oireachtas committee on behalf of the Climate Change Advisory Council Carbon Budgets Committee. The Oireachtas committee deliberated and approved the carbon budgets that were proposed by the Climate Change Advisory Council. The government subsequently approved those carbon budgets, and the Oireachtas agreed on those carbon budgets without the need for a vote. And that was an interesting outcome for me, because at times climate policy and energy policy can be quite contentious across the different political party perspectives. So to come to a situation where there was approval without the need for a vote was interesting. Now, you can argue that that was a positive or a negative, depending on, because it reduced the level of deliberation in some respects as well. So there's different perspectives on that, but it was surprising to me to get that cross-party political consensus. And I think the co-production process and the steps of the engagement helped with that in terms of providing confidence in that. The fourth and final area of this bridging between research and policy that I wanted to touch on is about building absorptive capacity. And because in terms of bridging between research and policy, there's requirements on both that are atypical. Researchers, we don't have training necessarily to engage with or understand the policy system. And that's a journey. And equally on the policy maker side or the policy practitioner side, that engagement with research is not something that's encouraged as much as it should be in terms of actually providing capacity or bandwidth to the civil servants to engage with research. So building absorptive capacity, there's a number of mechanisms to actually help enable this. And one that we was reported in a kind of parliamentary budget office tax analysis was related to the a model that we developed on the evolution of Ireland's car stock over time. And that was something we developed as a research project, and we published on it. But we also then, when we had finished developing the model, we handed it over to the Department of Transport. Now, when I say handed it over, that means we delivered it to them, but we provided training in the use of the model. And then the Department of Transport were able to use that to inform their own analysis and do their own analysis with the model that we developed. So that building of absorptive capacity wasn't about just delivering the model, it was about the training associated with its use. And the second example I'm going to touch on is something that Ian will develop more fully. It's part of that 8-year journey where we embarked on a secondment from a government department to a university for 2 days a week to essentially provide that bridging mechanism from between the civil service and the research ecosystem. Now, there are a lot more examples of researchers being seconded into government departments and into state agencies, and it's great to see that flourishing. This transfer in the other direction is still very, very rare. I won't say more about that because Ian will develop on that, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. But it's something that needs to be strengthened, and there's huge value in it. The final thing I want to touch on is a reflective piece that we published last year, kind of talking about this journey. Now, it started as a reflective piece, but it ended up being a guidance to researchers who want to achieve impact, policy impact from their research. And we sort of framed it around a 7-step plan. The first being actually to do the research and to publish it. And not only to make the results openly available, but where possible also the tools and certainly the input assumptions. So to have that transparency as well as the scientific rigor around the research. The second part is actually to frame research questions around policy questions so that you're getting at the heart of actually trying to provide a piece of research that's relevant to the policy system and that responds to specific policy needs. The third is the research results are not enough. That process of translating the research results into policy insights, it's a very useful skill for researchers to develop, but it makes the output much more usable and accessible by the policy system. The fourth is actually around how we communicate those findings. So again, it's not just about the numbers, the bar charts, it's finding ways in which we can actually communicate in as accessible as way and as useful a way as possible the insights. The fifth one then is about active engagement with the policy system, being proactive. It's very important to actually, for researchers and for civil servants and politicians indeed, to actually step out of their comfort zone and look for opportunities to engage with the other. That's what really is a core learning from my experience, that if we're waiting in the universities for ministers or for government departments to come and ask us questions or to read our research, we wait a long time because we don't, it generally, I suppose, indicates a misunderstanding about how the policy system works. So that engagement, proactive engagement, is hugely important. The sixth one then is this messy co-production policy, which is a really messy in the context of the different roles and being respectful of the different roles. And so it takes time to, in my experience, to be able to do this in an effective way. And it's not always going to be the case. I mean, while that journey has been there for us, it's not that we stop doing this one just when we get to this one. There's all of these steps are equally important. And there's feedback loops amongst them as well. And finally, then, the building absorptive capacity in the policy system. And that relates to, as I say, we had a number of examples of that, but But one of them is this secondment arrangement that we established with Ian Hughes. And so now, and actually this piece of work is available if people want to get more information as an open access chapter in a book that was published last year. We published this book on Springer. It's had 65,000 downloads already, the book, which I'm really proud of. And I think that open access dimension speaks to the first one in terms of making the stuff more openly available. And we make it openly available. If it is peer reviewed, if it is relevant, it will be picked up on. So I'm delighted to hand over to my wonderful colleague, Ian Hughes, to take you through the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm actually going to switch my first two slides here because having listened to Brian, it makes more sense to start with this. So remind me to go back to that first slide if I rush on. Yeah. So Brian has talked about the work that he's framed the work really in the context of climate change, and climate change being the problem that needs to be addressed. Very early in our discussions, whenever I started working with Brian 8 years ago, we started talking about this idea of climate isolationism. Climate isolationism is the idea that climate change can be taken out as an isolated problem and can be solved on its own. And we talked through this and said this isn't the case. We're in a situation where we don't just have climate change as the problem, we have all of this. The term polycrisis is used for this, but these pictures are to demonstrate all of the different aspects of this. Really, I'm struggling not to use particular words, that we're in the middle of at the moment. So the first is about, I think the first one is climate change and the wildfires in California. The second two are about war in Ukraine and Gaza. This third one is the threat of nuclear war, which I do reviews for the Irish Times, and I've just finished a review on the nuclear age. And that's terrifying, reading that book and what Putin has been using nuclear blackmail in Ukraine since the start of the war. So this, for those of us who are around the same age with me, the nuclear threat receded in the 90s with the disarmament decade, but now it's back. These other crises then are about environmental destruction, about pollution. This is about global inequality and inequality between countries. And then this is, you could say, the response to all of that. How democratic politics is breaking down, how authoritarian, autocratic leaders are gaining popular support. So the idea that we can take climate change out as a single problem and look at that in its own right, we don't agree with that. We are in this polycrisis. We also think that the roots of all of these crises are similar. And part of the research is to try and dig into what are the roots of all of these crises and how can we address those multiple crises at their roots and not in terms of reform and superficial interventions that aren't going to address. So I'll go back to my first one. I swapped them around because that context is the context within which we're working within the Department of Education. So my partner in crime, Sarah Rochford, and myself, we both started within the Department of Education just over a year ago. Pat McCarthy and Tomás O'Rourke, Tomás is our Assistant Secretary, they're both joining us online. And that context really provides the challenge for starting up a research unit within the Department of Education. It's the context within which, the question overhanging it, of course, is how do you educate the next generation when they're growing up within that polycrisis? What skills, what ways of thinking, what critical thinking will that generation need in order to rethink a world that's very different than the world we're in? So this really then is a snapshot of what Sarah and I and Pat and Tomás have been working on within this past year or thereabouts. Whenever we started, the first thing we did was to talk to all the other research units and all other government departments. And one of the things that you get from doing that exercise is realising the expertise that there is within the civil service and the generosity that there is within the civil service in terms of the generosity of the people that we were talking to and sharing their experience that we could learn from. And so we've been, all of the government departments pretty much say the same thing to us. They have two streams in their research units. One part of it is looking at building internal capacity, and the other strand on it is really about strategic direction. And so we have that same framing in terms of what we're working on. A lot of what we do is by capacity building internally, research for tender, helping staff across the department, a research newsletter that we send out, and so on. And then the second strand of it is this strategic forward lookers, futures thinking. And Brian mentioned that futures thinking because that's really the link between what I'm doing now in the Department of Education and what we're doing in UCC. So in terms of the strategic growth, I'll come back to this again, but there's one of the slides I'm going to be showing about the narrative of research in Ireland, how Ireland's research ecosystem has grown over this past 20 years. The Department of Education spend within the government's overall spend is less than 0.5% of the overall government funding for research. The vast majority of that goes into science and technology research. These problems, are not going to be solved by science and technology alone. That 0.5% that the department gets in education research, we think has to grow substantially in order to be able to address these kinds of problems. So one of the things that we're in the middle of at the moment is we had a research summit in February that brought together, and that's the reason I put these three policymakers, researchers and teachers and principals. A lot of the conversations for, I guess there's three departments, ourselves, health and children, maybe one or two others. But the research for policy is a big issue, but research for practice is also an equally important issue. Translating the research into classroom practice, into health practice, into childcare practice, and so on. So that's we've highlighted those three as it's not for the department, it's research for policy and research for practice. And we had an event in February which brought these three communities together, and we're organising our annual, what's now going to be an annual education research summit for November, and launching a futures-oriented research network. We put out a call for abstracts for that. We were expecting 60 to 80 abstracts. We got over 370, which is phenomenal. It's a hugely valuable exercise in terms of mapping what's happening in terms of educational research in the system. If we go forward then to the work that Brian and myself have been doing together, this is an idea of one of the narratives for the change that we've seen over that time. So whenever I started with Brian, I was working in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment at the time. I came in from Forfos, and I was going to the OECD Science Technology Innovation Policy Committee, and I was a total advocate for this, religious zealot for national innovation systems. That the purpose for research and development was technology. Research and innovation will get startups, will get new technologies that will provide economic growth. That economic growth provides the basis for societal prosperity and so on. When I was at the OECD, that narrative was also being supplemented with this one. It wasn't being pushed aside. But the second one is about system transformation, and that's what Brian has been talking about in his presentation. It's not just about technology for economic growth without direction. It's about the technologies we need for low carbon transformation, for food transition, and so on. So system transition brings in bigger questions, it brings in a bigger role for government, and it also brings in more disciplines. It's not just about science technology, because these are also about people's behaviour. And the third step, and this is very much where our project now in UCC is it's not just about innovation for growth. It's not just about innovation for system change. It's innovation for entire societal change in order to deal with the problems we have in the poly crisis. And again, when we talk about that system, the narrative is really one about the values and the paradigm within which we live. Things like our separation from nature, our ability to exploit nature as a limited resource, techno-optimism, technology will solve the problems, the primacy of material progress over other forms of progress, and a market-driven society and the balance between the market and government. So those are all the things that come into play when you go into this third frame. And that's what we've been doing. This DSIS is the Deep Societal Innovation for Sustainability and Human Flourishing project. My funding now, this is a unique kind of setup that we've managed to put in place. And if Dara O'Neill is online, Dara, Eva Conduit in Education was also one of the key people in helping this happen. But the agreement is a secondment agreement between the Department of Education and Youth and UCC. And my 2 days a week with UCC are funded by the EPA under this funding for this project. That opens up the possibility for research funders to put into the research calls that policymakers can be involved in the research projects. So this opens a new avenue for research policy collaboration. These are the three of the key papers that we've published. This one's just been submitted. And it's, when we talk about research capacity building, the thing that I have mostly in my mind is about framing. What are the frames that we are developing policy within? And this is, in this project, that's really what we're doing. We're trying to argue that we need to change the framing that we're thinking about investments within. This first one, beyond climate change to deep societal reimagining, is in World Futures. That's where we say, this isn't just about the climate crisis. This is about reimagining politics. It's about reimagining economics. It's about reimagining technology. Those three things are usually included. The other three that we have, religion, gender, and education, are usually excluded. But if we're talking about cultural change, religion, gender, and education are central. The second one, about how do you conceptualize global transformation? We have, in our environmental research lab, we have a way for inviting a conversation around how you think about something as massive as boiling the ocean. And then our third one is about the dynamics of system change. How am I doing for time, John?
Don't worry about time.
Yeah. And on this one, I'll just say very briefly about what we mean by this, because when we talk about narratives of change, we've come a long way from what Brian has been talking about, the narrative of change being we need technological substitution, engagement with communities, but in the direction of technological substitution. What we're talking about here is the paradigm of the society within which we live. At the moment, it's one that has dominant values around hierarchy, dominant values around economic growth, about material progress. We're arguing, and there's a lot of literature on this, that there's a second social template that is much more about care, much more about gift exchange, much more about working on things of purpose rather than working on things for profit, social good. And our transformation is a narrative, as well as all the technology that we need. It's also a narrative of transformation from one template of society to another. So I think this is my last slide. In terms of how we bring these two together, because I think it's really, in one sense, it's really fortuitous that I'm now within the Department of Education, working with Sarah and so on. At this time when the Department of Education is setting up this whole research unit, and we've come to this stage in the journey with Brian and myself and the colleagues, Ed Byrne and Jeremy Alley, and O'Neill and so on, who are working on our project. We've come to the point in the project where we now frame it in these terms. We now frame it in terms of cultural transformation. And what does that mean for education? And so one of the things that we're hoping to do, we've submitted an abstract to the journal Social Inclusion. And one of the things we're hoping to do is that as a research team in UCC, we would come to the Department of Education and present some of these ideas to policymakers who are working in social inclusion, and simply ask the question, are these concepts too far away from policymaking to be of any use to you? Are there ways in which these concepts can inform your thinking of how you're doing your job? Are there ways these concepts can help, and this sort of far future thinking can help us to shape the policies that we're making today? And I think we have two more slides, but I think maybe we use that during the discussion. Is that the way to?
I'd say so, because we'd be good to get some input from you.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks to the two of you for your reflection coming into today and for what you've just said in a very concise way, but in a very challenging way. You really put it up to us at the end there. It's about changing societal understandings of what we're all doing and why we're all here, really. And so you've asked some very fundamental questions. So I'm actually not going to put any more questions to you. I'm going to open it up because I think we have a few people itching to get in. So I'm going to open it up to the floor, and we need to just bring this mic out because this mic is for online. Anybody want to come in? So I'm going to introduce the person. There is also this here that is former PD and former minister, and we actually will have a session with Dennis early next year, along with somebody from your office. So we want to actually open up this nature of discussion. But you're really involved in the research and policy side, and we're really well to be here today. So
no, and the reason that I came here today was that paper that was published in the book back in 2024. I recall reading that, and it really resonated with me because I was on the receiving end of some of the work that Brian did, and I thought it would be useful to give an alternative perspective from a decision maker's perspective in relation to some of this. And just to give people here and online a perspective in relation to the challenges that I had as minister at the time. So I took office in 2016. And so we just had the Energy White Paper had just been published. I was involved in implementing that. I was involved in negotiating the Energy Efficiency Directive at EU level, the Renewable Energy Directive, and within 5 weeks of taking office, we had Brexit, which had huge implications in terms of energy security for Ireland. Then in August of 2016, I became Climate Minister. And on top of that, then I had the implementation of the Climate Action Low Carbon Development Act, which had just been enacted by the previous Dáil. We had the EU's draft effort sharing directive, which was setting the objectives in terms of climate reductions targets for 2030. We had the review of the emissions trading system. And we also had, and we were very involved in drafting Ireland's first clean air strategy. Now, you'd think that they would be the top of my priority list, but as Environment Minister, the top of my priority list was waste. That was the crisis that kept coming back onto my table. So all of these really complex policy issues in terms of implementing policy, implementing legislation, and negotiating at EU level. And the work that Brian had done in terms of modelling was very important in terms of the decisions that I was making, the approaches that I was taking in terms of the implementation of policy, where I could pose questions to my officials and they would, along with Brian, work up models on that. Simple models. It didn't go into the detailed methodology of how it was done, but it showed me very visually, you know, if you took decision A, this was the likelihood of what would happen. And it made it much easier for me then to start making decisions because I had that level of clarity in terms of modelling. What was critically important here, though, was the fact that the officials also had been involved in developing this model, had been engaged with you in terms of what it could and could not do. So when I would put a supplementary question, the officials were well able to explain to me, well, look, the model cannot do that. So I, as minister, not only had the modelling results, but I had the limitations in relation to that modelling results, and I had the caveats that came with it, which was very important in terms of being able to make decisions, to know the limitations in relation to that. And I was sharing with Brian earlier on, one of those particular models we used in terms of the effort sharing negotiations and in terms of the trajectory for Ireland out to 2030. And I remember actually speaking directly with my German colleague, explaining the complexity of the challenge that we had and actually showing the graphic model that had been done by the team in UCC. And he could see very visually the challenge and problem that I had by showing him that. And actually, my colleague in Latvia, the minister in Latvia and the minister in Lithuania had a very similar problem. And they actually used my graphs to make the same argument to the European Commission, which were actually eventually accepted by the European Commission. And the point I'm making here is it comes down to the issue of science diplomacy, because not only was the modelling that you did useful for me in terms of making decisions as a minister, but I could also use it in terms of my negotiations with the European Commission, in terms of our 2030 targets, but also to be able to build coalitions to support my position, but also in terms of science diplomacy, in terms of building relationships with other ministers around the EU Council table who are also using the work and research produced here in Ireland to actually make their case and be able to refer to it. And I think it is important that, you know, being able to produce these models and then being able to apply them to very specific policy challenges has huge implications for politics and policy as a whole, and for our engagement as a small nation, both within the European Union and wider afield. And just one final point then that I'd like to make, and that is in terms of the engagement that Brian and his team had with the Oireachtas Committee. I was involved in establishing that particular Oireachtas Committee on climate action. And one of the things I was very anxious to see happen was that the TDs and senators and the Oireachtas had full access to the information that I had, because at least then when we were going into the Dáil having a debate, we were debating based on the facts. We might disagree on the policy direction based on those facts, but at least everyone was starting from a level playing pitch, and that ensured that the debates and contributions and proposed policy solutions that were coming from the opposition were far more weighted in evidence and far more useful to me in terms of my engagements both domestically and at EU level. And I just wanted to add those particular perspectives to the presentations that were given here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi. So for people online who can't see, I'm Jennifer Brennan. I'm from the Department of Climate, Energy and the Environment. So I suppose I have one comment, Ian, just to say, I wholeheartedly agree with what you said about this being a societal challenge as opposed to just a technological challenge. I think from my perspective as someone who's come into this area in about 3 years ago, knew very little about climate, apart from the fact that it was not great, was that an understanding of the technological nature behind it is that what we don't really have is a knowledge gap in many ways. We kind of know what we need to do. What we actually have is an implementation gap. And that's more of a sort of a social challenge than a technological challenge. You know, it's about getting people to change their behaviour. You know, Brian mentioned the campaign around Your Journey Counts. You know, we need people to do things around the diet that they eat, the way that they travel, the way that they heat their homes. So that's a huge challenge, I think, for our department. It's not necessarily, we know what we need to do, it's just getting people to do it, and the systems that government can put in place to encourage that. So, you know, be it taxation or reducing regulations, speeding up our planning system, putting in place grants. So I think, you know, you made a really good point. The other thing I just wanted to ask you was, and it's about this secondment idea. So one of the things that we're toying with in the department, so we have an action in our research strategy about trying to second civil servants into research organisations, but I think not everybody's going to be in the position to be able to step away from their job for a significant period of time, even if it's a part-time arrangement like yours, Ian. So we've been looking at what other countries do in the space, and we've seen quite a few examples in, say, the UK and in Germany, where universities or groups of universities will put together I guess an offer for civil servants to come and have a series of sort of structured research meetings or engagements with research teams around a particular theme or topic that they're struggling with at the time. And we're considering that might be a good way to get people engaged, considering the time limitations. So I just wonder what you might think of that, and do you think that would be useful, or would we be better off to say let's just try and put people in for periods of time? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks very much, Dennis. I wasn't aware of the extent of that international impact, and that was it's great to hear. And also I suppose those reflections of, because we see where this goes to a certain level, and so I really appreciate the insights and that added, I suppose, impact that you've shared in terms of how the research has kind of been utilised and supportive of. Yeah, because most of the examples I used were national policy, but that supporting negotiations, I think, is a very important one. And I was very struck by that, that diplomacy and that building coalitions, because that's hugely important in the context of those negotiations that I'm aware of. And just 2 points on Jennifer's reflections. I fully agree it's an implementation challenge, not a knowledge challenge. I do worry when we can tend to then reduce that to behaviour, and that can sort of blindside us from structural inequalities, systemic dimensions. But increasingly, I think the recognition is growing that it is the implementation gap is where things are at, but we haven't quite, I suppose, shaped either the research or the policy to properly, I suppose, resource the what's required to address that, because it is challenging, actually, because it's easier in a sense to deal with things if it's a knowledge gap than if it's an implementation gap. But it's very I think instructive to frame it in that way, and then to look at what the implications are that come from that. I think on the secondment, and just so you know, the framing in the research strategy that you mentioned that talks about the value of those types of secondments helped us in terms of actually being able to enable this secondment. So there's the implementation of policy that can help in terms of these processes very much. It was very useful, because we're still talking about something that's relatively new, even though like we've had the arrangement for 8 years. To me, it's a no-brainer that this should be enabled. And your point is well made that it's not for everyone, but I think enabling it is a starting point for those who can make use of it. And I fully agree then that there needs to be other things as well. And we've grappled with this, and it might be useful to have a conversation following up on this in terms of, because I've thought of some of those mechanisms where, I mean, one example is, we have it with PhD students doing a day a week in industry. So there is day a week options, in both directions. It doesn't have to be 2 days or full time. And that can help. But another option that we've considered is kind of having even an hour in a given week, where it's an ask us anything type open discussion forum, where the civil servants can have access to that research capacity, and that. I think universities coming together as well is a very useful, and there are increasingly numbers. We've an increasing number of networks now. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network Ireland, the All Ireland Climate and Biodiversity Research Network. So there are mechanisms that can help that. So it's so great points, and thanks very much.
Just what comes to mind, Jennifer, whenever you ask the question, when we were meeting Teresa McGuire from HRB. One of the things Teresa talked about in HRB's experience was this portfolio of engagement. And so you have everything from engagement with policymakers for data, for modelling. You have everything from that right through to, I think, what we've been working on, which is about reframing. It's about deep thinking, deep reframing. And so the fact that we've been working together and with colleagues in UCC for 8 years has allowed that to happen over time. So I think we need that portfolio of all of those. But I would argue, given my second slide in the poly crisis, we urgently need much more of the in-depth engagement of policy with the kinds of richness and expertise in universities in transdisciplinarity. About sociology, about psychology. What are these subjects telling us? Because a lot of the knowledge is there. And as you say, it isn't about just reform. This is about deep structural change. So how do we, some of the answers are there, but it's about actually making the difficult decisions to make those changes happen. So I would, in defense of what the particular model that we've been doing, I think the real value of that is in long-term engagement that allows in-depth connection between policy and research.
So just coming back on the secondment point, I think the government through Research Ireland have put arrangements in place for some researchers to go into government and departments and agencies. And we've had 2 goes at that, and I think there's a third one planned. But the other way, and we've heard from Jennifer, we've heard from Ian and Brian, I'm an example of it as well. It's each one is particularly complicated to arrange. They make it sound very easy. It took a while, and there was a hip in the middle, and then a reinvigoration, if you like. But there are lessons to be learned from all of those to feed into future engagements, and that the different options, I think, are, and it won't be a one size fits all, but I think there are lots of ideas coming. We need to move to a better system where many of those are enabled. The flexibility of the EPA that you've referred to is a great potential enabler, and so that's really, really interesting. And we also have in John O'Connor, one of the co-organisers, he's seconded from a state agency, qualifications and Quality Assurance Ireland, QQI, to us. So there are different arrangements for this, but they're very, very limited. So Mark is going to go just to some questions from the online. We've quite a few people online.
So we've got 32 online. You've picked people up as we've gone. I mean, they're voting with their feet. Now they're coming on as we go. So I've got a couple of questions. Aoife Long from UCC, a colleague, Brian, is asking how was the initial connection made, and I think that's part of the problem or the difficulty of new lectures and ECRs is getting started. You guys are down the line now, and you're talking about harvesting something, but you had to start somewhere. And so, what's your advice on getting started? And then Niamh Garvey from NESC asking the question. First of all, she really enjoyed both presentations. She said, really, for Ian possibly, but Brian might want to comment too. To what extent do you see these bigger, deep framing questions already percolating into the education curriculum design and so on and so forth? So the big societal change agenda, do you see it moving in already to the structure of the design and delivery of education? And secondly of all, she asks the question, to what degree is futures-oriented work in the network you're setting up linking in with futures work in other policy arenas and other departments and so on, not least given the poly crisis involves solving many public problems at the one time. Finally, Raymond Feely, I think, is just typed in a comment there just as I've been speaking. Arguably, policy trends tend to be responsive and reactive to external drivers, stakeholders, business interests, mediated through lobbying, European regulatory systems, and so on. So I'm guessing the question here is, how do you move towards the deep framing in the context of the realpolitik of the political system and electoral cycles and so on and so forth? So yeah, perhaps you could reflect upon those three questions, and I would like to come back at the end, Seán, because there are fantastic things that have been noted there.
I might take the first one and then maybe come back after if just to Aoife, and hi Aoife. I've given this presentation before, and I used a slide with a picture of a train because we're based in Cork, and the most government departments and the Dáil, the Oireachtas, is in Dublin. So there's a lot of legwork involved in this, and of course what I presented is reflecting on many years, but the first few years are really about knocking on doors and not having much impact, but actually, doggedly, stubbornly sticking at it. And actually, that's one of the things we have here in terms of the some of these reflections that we didn't get to. But like for me, motivation was a very critical to actually sustain that kind of effort, particularly in those early days. You can call it stubbornness or motivation, either works. But I really wanted to. Part of my reason for doing research was to achieve impact, and so the motivation was critically important. And the second piece I found often important, and this links to the last question in a different way, because lobbying is an interesting one, because some researchers use their research results legitimately to do lobbying, and And that's a choice. That's a decision that can be taken by researchers. In my case, it was very important actually to, on the second point there, to listen to the policy needs and try and use research to meet those needs. And that's a different starting point and a different way of engaging. And the third one also, Aoife, is critically important. I mean, lots of mistakes. And we in this kind of reflective piece, we don't talk much about the mistakes, but it speaks back to that sticking at it. But the initial connection was, contacting either, government departments or state agencies and attending events, reaching out to people and being proactive in terms of talking about what it is we were doing and trying to understand their needs, that dual focus. And that leads to then over time to building trust, because that's hugely important in terms of the relationship side of things. And because the peer review process is a very enabling thing in terms of trust in the actual results, but there's also the human contact and being able to kind of rely on each other or discuss things in a way that and this there's another dimension to this, which is around confidentiality, and this is particularly important in the co-production piece, that being mindful of the I suppose the political ramifications of some of these discussions and how that engagement is done. It has to be done in a responsive and trustful way in order for it to work. And the final piece is around the resourcing, which is something we touched on in terms of these mechanisms. And the mechanisms, the bridging piece is one part of it, but also there needs to be resourcing on the civil service side in terms of enabling the civil servants to have the bandwidth. And equally that applies to politicians. And also on the research side, that kind of valuing this, because when I was starting out, the engagement part of the research activity that was valued was engagement with industry. In the promotion rounds, it was like, are you doing stuff outside the university? What companies are you talking? It was really narrow. And that has broadened over time because the translation of research into industry and to business is hugely important, but equally the translation into policy and the translation into wider society, to citizens and communities is very important. So that's a very long-winded answer to the first question. Over to Ian.
I guess, what's the question about how we made our first contact?
Yeah, I think it's how do we get the ball rolling?
Sorry.
How do we get the ball rolling on the relationship?
So I guess that was at the beginning. I was working in Department of Education, having coming in from Forfos, and I went to John Hughes, who was the head of HR and DETI at the time, and asked him if I were to get if I were able to work for UCC for 2 days a week, would it be possible from the department's point of view?
But you must have had a thought about why you wanted to work for UCC. So how did that happen, that you wanted to work for UCC?
That was part of that narrative that I said about I was working in national innovation systems. Yeah. I was at OECD and I was seeing that narrative change.
Yeah.
And Brian was one of the top people in Ireland who was already working in that system transition. So that was how the connection. I asked John Hughes, he said yes. I went and talked to Brian, he said yes. And that's how it happened. But the question should also be, how does connection made and maintained over a period of 8 years? And I have in my mind the view of the system, which is one of this, like nodes with, rods with nodes at each, And when the question comes to those nodes, people have to say yes. If people say no, nothing happens. And there's a long line of people who say yes, from John Hughes, from Aoife Conduit, Barry O'Neill in EPA, and Tomás O'Rourke and Pat McCarthy, who are now enabling it, and support from Seán and Rory Doyle and people like that, and within DETI. Yeah. So there's a long list. That maintenance is like this. You're continually, when you have to renew this, you're continually coming to another node, and will that node say yes? So it's really important to have people who say yes. Yeah. Will I take some of the others?
Sure.
In terms of whether these deep framing ideas are happening within the education system and within policy? The answer is very definitely yes. As I said, Sarah and myself have put out the call for abstracts. We got 370 of them. And you can see from within those abstracts the range and depth of research that's happening, from everything around democratic competency, gender construction, social inclusion, looking at structural issues of exclusion, and climate change. So all of that research is happening. There's lots of research happening. I think part of the challenge is to join it all up and get more funding for it. Yeah, but those framings are definitely being talked about. How you make it happen when you're within a society that's structurally designed not to make it happen, because that's essentially where we are. Yeah. So how do you make this happen in a society that's designed to not make it happen? Unfortunately, the way that this has happened in the past is through war. Yeah. The challenge for us is, are we smart enough to make this happen without catastrophe? That's really the problem that we're facing. But there is lots of expertise, and again, that's part of the group. Maggie O'Neill, for example, in sociology, Jeremy Ali, who's from sociology, who's in engineering. Those, and Bob Bruma, who's our PhD student. Those are the problems that we're grappling with. And we're going back to the 1930s and 1940s. We're looking at Hannah Arendt. We're looking at critical theory. We're looking at what were these people thinking about these deep structural change and how you can avoid it without having catastrophe wipe out your society before you can. There was a quote from Kurt Vonnegut, who said, "Humanity may be the first species to go extinct because it wasn't cost effective for us to do otherwise." And I think that's part of reimagining economic.
Do you want to tell us a bit about your futures work as well, Ian, that you're involved with?
Well, I guess all of this is the futures work.
But there's a kind of a movement, might be a bit strong, but there's a group of people coming together collectively beyond the immediate people you're working with.
Yeah. So that's Donncha Kavanagh is one of the people who's leading that. There's a series of seminars with the IIEA at the moment on Finland's futures thinking and the structures that are in place there. So that's another part of, so we're linked to that. But also to add to the question about how is this linked to other government departments, I think the way we're doing that is informally. We have this informal network with all the other government departments, research units, and talking to people about what's happening, knowing what's happening within their departments, what's happening within ours, and connecting people within each department to those things. I'm a great believer in informality.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to the floor again. Does anybody else want to come in from the floor? Right.
Ray O'Neill, Department of Physics here in Maynooth. Thanks very much, both of you, for the presentation and the discussion. I was struck by a couple of things, well, many things during it, but maybe first of all, what Ian was just talking about on the linking role. And obviously, you're a pioneer in this, in trying to find a way to link. But it strikes me that because of the restrictions, I think Jennifer mentioned, well, not everybody can do a secondment. Finding the way not just to have those informal networks, but ways to actually build into the secondment the role that says, well, we now go back to the various departments. We are actively bringing the conversation to those who need to have the absorptive capacity to then be framing things for the political decisions. That would be really useful. And I'd be interested in how much of that is happening or otherwise at the moment. And maybe just a completely random thought. Somebody mentioned in a question online whether this was now having impacts on second level curricula. And I recall that quite a number of years ago, SFI used to have a program where they brought second level teachers in to be involved in cutting edge research. And that something like that in the policy space might be very, very fruitful. Unfortunately, it was a program that didn't last too long, but I thought it was brilliant. And I do think the secondment that goes both ways that you're talking about is also really, really important. But find ways to build on it so it isn't just a flash in the pan is something that maybe we should think about.
Anybody else want to come in?
Just on that, there's a new leaving cert. Look at that.
Thanks. On what Ray's mentioned there's a new leaving cert on climate action or
Yeah, I chair the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, and there's obviously some new leaving cert subjects and some as part of the senior cycle redevelopment. And Anya Highland, who's here, is also an expert on that, including, and we've the new science subjects as well. So there's a lot of change happening, but that's not taken away from the point, which I think is really, really relevant. It's just adding to it. Would anybody else want to come in before we go back to the panel again? Somebody coming in there? No, anybody coming in? Do you want to come? Do you want to respond to or reflect on what Ray has said?
I'd agree. I think because there's two parts of this. One is we need more enabling mechanisms, and then we need to actually encourage uptake. And how that's done. So and I suppose I've spent more time thinking about the enabling mechanisms than the encouraging or promoting uptake. And so for me, it raises an interesting point on that. And I think some of the things that Jennifer mentioned earlier, some of the different modalities are a way in which actually the message can get out and permeate and maybe, and events like this, in terms of showing these interactions and bridging mechanisms, I think are another way of getting the mechanisms, getting the knowledge around those opportunities out there and the benefits. But but you give me something to think about. So thank you in terms of thinking more about it.
I guess off the top of my head, what I think is going back to the Department, and this is a personal view, going back to the figure Department of Education has 0.5% of government's funding in research. Like what structures before research and before SFI was put in place, there weren't the structures that enable the engagement between researchers and enterprise. There weren't the structures that there are now for all sorts of. I think we're at that stage in the humanities and social sciences. And the value that humanities, social sciences research can make to society. We don't have the infrastructures. We don't have centres of scale that we have in science and technology. So I think part of the answer to that is a much larger investment, much bigger thinking in terms of framing of the role of humanities, social sciences for addressing the poly crisis, how you bring education into that. So I would be, I think this isn't something that you think about in terms of individual sort of, I think this is a step change in investment and a fundamental rethinking of the structures we need to make those connections happen.
I'm going to just bring on your hand in a sec, but I want to just ask you a question about, you talk about the understanding of everybody's understanding of society has to change, and you talk about the research work that's underway and the positive stuff in terms of the examples in education. But what contribution can the research community make above that to try and impact on societal understandings? This seems to be and Brian said he doesn't think there's a risk it's just about behaviour, but actually what you're really saying is the fundamental aims of society need to change. So how can the research community and the policy making community come together to try and get involved to try and shape, influence, inform society to rethink, given that we operate in national systems, international systems, so many different, it's like that's a huge conundrum. So have you any reflections about that? Or maybe I'll go to Anya as well, because you may be asking something completely different, but you can think about that.
Thank you very much. No, and first of all, I just want to thank both Brian and Ian. I think it's been really very interesting and also very, very clear. Some of your what you've put up there is really very helpful. I'm delighted to hear that you have had the Department of Education and Youth has had such a good response to the request for research papers, 300 and something. And it doesn't surprise me because the numbers of teachers, I was listening with interest to your point, in recent years, in the last 20, 30 years, very large numbers, more than in any other profession, I think, of teachers come back into universities where the masters and doctoral programs are worked in a way that suits them. So there are very, very large numbers of teachers back in the classroom who have engaged in research because they have to do research for their masters and for their doctoral thesis. And I think what you're beginning to do now in the Department of Education and Youth is really great, because this gives them an opportunity. I'm sure quite a lot of those proposals that you're getting or submissions are actually coming from teachers on the ground, and just talking about flexibility in terms of civil servants being involved in research and vice versa. One of the other blockages that exist at the moment, for example, people like myself who spent most of my life initially in policy, but eventually in academic life, I would have liked to have been able to go back to the classroom for a year. And I would have certainly liked my colleagues to have done so, because as an academic, and I'm sure the same is true about other professions, practice informs research and research informs practice. And we can, as researchers, have very, maybe, I shouldn't call them esoteric, but maybe theoretical views that in practice wouldn't work. And if you have the opportunity as a researcher to actually be engaged in trying to implement your practice, I'm thinking more on curriculum change now, and then vice versa, you can feed back into the policy and decision making. But actually it's very, very difficult to do that. It's very difficult. I mean, a few of my colleagues and myself did go from academia back into teaching for a couple of years, or 1 year even. And you learn an awful lot that way, and vice versa. So there's another blockage there. In other words, we have all these silos, and I think we should loosen up the silos so that there can be more movement between policy and practice, and policy and implementation, and policy and research. Thank you very much for your talk.
So I guess you're preaching to Moss O'Rourke's Bible, yeah, in terms of connections between research, policy, and practice, and that, just to say, that's one of the main aims of this futures-oriented educational research network. There are existing networks like TREX and the Educational Studies Association of Ireland and so on that you know about. And what we want to do with Europe, with the Research Futures Forum, is that every event that we organise brings together those three communities. Yeah, so that's part of the knitting together of these three. And so that's in terms of, to your question, Seán, about, I think it's the same answer that I give to Raymond. We don't have the structures. We can set up a network, we can set up, but where's the funding of the scale that goes into science and technology centres to address this kind of issue? And it isn't there. So I think that's the next step in Ireland's, for me, next step in Ireland's national research and innovation journey is to be putting humanities, social sciences and education on the same footing. And then what structures do we need to build in order to make that real?
And if, just adding to that, I think the other dimension that's important is supporting co-production of research with other actors in society. And we had a fascinating project over 5 years now on the Dingle Peninsula with a community who wanted to embark on the energy transition to a low carbon future. And we worked with them, and part of the work that we did, part of the research was providing some numbers and some options in terms of technology. But a bigger part, or a part that was more impactful, was about organisation, about how to engage, about governance, about structuring around that. And it became essentially a co-production of research with the community. And it was interesting because we had an industry partner involved as well. And the focus of the industry partner was on accelerating kind of technology adoption, low carbon technology adoption. But it was interesting to see their engagement with the process and how they saw that while that was happening, what was really more insightful and impactful was this wider building of societal capacity and societal infrastructure. And then we were looking for language to describe what we were talking about, and we framed it around the diffusion of sustainability, because diffusion of technology is a well understood concept, but diffusion of sustainability brings that societal architecture, additional element of community development, capacity building, and then success breeding success. Because one of the interesting things was that there was one sustainable energy community to start with, and then following on from that, the dairy farmers set up their own sustainable energy community. The tourism and hospitality sector set up their own sustainable energy community. And I heard yesterday that there's 4 then regional residential sustainable energy communities that have emerged. So it's a phenomenal, it's a gift that keeps giving, but we don't have good structures actually for supporting the co-production of research with communities and citizens. One of the real barriers we found was, how do we pay for their participation? Because with the industry participants, they can bring funds. With the policy engagement, they can bring funds. But that's not always the case with communities and citizens. And there's a real gap in that. So that's one of the areas, I think, in terms of where we can migrate from the knowledge focus to implementation focus. And I think that's needed, as well as, to complement what he was saying in terms of a greater emphasis of scaled research on this as well.
Okay.
Can I come in, Seán? Just one. I think one of the things that Brian does so well in terms of, it's the acknowledgement of expertise in different communities and the non-hierarchical cooperation between them. Yeah, I think that's exactly what Brian does, and that's the secret to that's success. No?
Yeah.
So I think that's a challenge for all of the communities involved, but I think that's where you get the results.
Okay, can I just open up the floor? Does anybody have any comments that they're dying to make? No.
Carrie-Anne Barry from the Centre for Ocean Energy Research. I just wonder, Brian and Ian, whether you think that there's a role for funding agencies in this. I mean, if funding proposals were going to be weighted, and some of the weighting was going to go towards engagement with policy, as well as engagement with industry, and requiring that multidisciplinary approach. I noticed that there was an EU call recently, and it was a technical EU call, but it required the appointment of a sociologist specifically. And I thought that that was probably quite positive, but maybe there should be something there as well that requires engagement with policy, rather than occasionally proposals will say, okay, yeah, we'll get out a white paper, but is that actually going anywhere? Is it really meaningful? And I just wonder what the panel think about that.
Well, I fully agree. There's a huge onus on the research funding bodies to, I suppose, see the opportunity that's here and put in mechanisms to enable it. But we are seeing positive signs. You cited the EU, and I think one of the things in the recent framework call, we're at framework 9 or 10, at 9, I think, at the moment, the Horizon call, there was a strand of research focusing on missions oriented research. And that brings very much into sharp focus in terms of specific funding calls on targeted kind of solution implementation orientated research activity. And in some ways, Research Ireland does it in the challenge-based funding. But the fact that now, because we've talked about SFI in the past tense, because now with SFI and the IRC both being evolved into Research Ireland, I think there's a huge opportunity, both in terms of greater acknowledgement of interdisciplinary research, but also that transdisciplinary piece of engaging with others. And I see a higher valuing of that emerging in terms of the engagement with citizens and communities and with policy. A gap I still see is in kind of not so much an acknowledgement, but actually mechanisms that fund the community participation. That's still a big gap. But that trend towards what you're talking about is there, but it needs to be bolstered. And we do still have the challenge that, and this speaks to what you mentioned earlier, that overall our public investment in research is much lower than our EU counterparts. So there needs to be a step up in terms of investment. And part of that step up does need to focus very much on the greater valuing of the contribution from social sciences and arts and humanities.
Could I just say one thing quickly? Again, going back to Teresa McGuire's idea of this portfolio, I think one of the things that I'd really like to see more money going into is transdisciplinarity. But the way that we understand that word is that the research in one discipline undermines the foundations of another. Yeah. So research in sustainability is actually telling you there's something wrong with your economic framing. Yeah. So fund that type of disruptive research and ideas that starts to reframe and restructure the way that we structure society. That's true transdisciplinarity. It changes the disciplines.
Okay.
We need those teams together.
Right. I just want to come back with a few comments at the end, but Mark wants to come in first.
Yeah, thank you. Online it says, thanks to you both for a brilliant, wonderful seminar. And I was going to say thanks. I thought you were referring to, but no, he followed up by saying it's Brian and Ian he's talking about. So well done on a great contribution. So I want to precursor these comments by saying that I fundamentally agree with your framing of this through polycrisis. We're thinking about the relationship between research and policy at a very particular historical moment, and you're conjuring that relationship and figuring what that relationship should look like in the context of a period of compounding, cumulative crisis. And I've been doing a lot of thinking around this using Gramscian ideas, because of Italian writing 100 years ago, with interesting ideas around the 30s, the 20s, the chilling echoes of nationalist populism that was resonating across Europe at the time, and the role of the intellectual then in that context, and a kind of scholar policy activism that Gramsci was referring to, which I think you're talking about, that deep framing. So I think I agree entirely, and I actually think it's the way to go. It's the fundamental ontology that we should be looking at this framework through. However, and I say this from the critiques that I've been having from trying to publish in this space, thinking of time in terms of crisis narratives invites us to think about time in a very particular way. And there are people who would see crisis narratives actually as part of the problems of why crisis is there in the first place. A lot of feminist post-colonial critiques of the idea that we're existing at a polycrisis moment would say, well, actually, there's a lot going on. Crisis is a kind of masculinist, totalizing narrative that you're putting research for policy, and it's limiting the way you're thinking about research for policy. So there is a question then about the work that a crisis narrative framework is doing in leading us to think about research and policy through that lens in ways that then enable and constrain certain ways of thinking about research for policy. So I don't think that's a legitimate critique, to be honest. And I think it's kind of some of these postmodern scholars taking it too far. I think we need crisis narratives, because otherwise you're not going to meet the moment. So taking crisis narratives seriously and overcoming that critique, I think that the problem that we then face is only deep reframing will do. And I think that's your point of departure. And again, I completely agree with that. And I would use the word disruptive, but that takes us into a very particular space. And I thought you were very skillful in the way you articulated that, navigating some path between non-revolutionary but still deeply radical societal transformation, working with and on policy, but not to destabilise the system, at the same time as almost implying that nothing less than institutional recalibration is going to fix the problems we need to be fixing. So we get this problem then that engaged in research for policy, which tends to be technocratic and feeding evidence into policy to improve, then becomes more advocacy, more becomes deep research, pointing out the flaws of business as usual and the need for a fundamental framing gestalt shift if we're going to tackle problems. I think that takes us into a different kind of research for policy relationship. Now, I think that initial framework you have allows you to get to there, because if you think of things as a polycrisis, as existential, and that the only way to pull ourselves back from the brink is going to be to fundamentally change things, then it leads you to make that case in a more compelling way. But as you say, you're trying to force deep reframing. I thought you put it well, Ian, in a system that doesn't want deep reframing. And so inevitably you're doing more than providing evidence for policy there. You're becoming fundamental to reset the common sense around about challenges. And I think that's really important, because in answer to Jennifer's question, what kind of short-term, long-term consultations do we need? What kind of interactions between research for policy? Well, the answer, I think, to that is that, the form follows function. If we're saying the outcome has to be to reset the gestalt, it's not enough then we have to, whatever we do, have forms of collaboration that allow us to get to that deep reframing. Otherwise, the collaborations are actually just reproducing the status quo and selling up the system short, and we'll just continue as business as usual. So I'm wondering if what you're calling for is actually a wee bit more radical than the evidence for policy agenda is, and I totally agree with you. But I'm wondering if you're looking for evidence for radical social change within the system, not so much evidence for policy, which I think is maybe a sleepier, quieter concept. So, wonderful. Really appreciate that. Really enjoyed the presentation. Couldn't agree with you more in your conclusion and analysis.
Thanks, Mark. So we're going to round off, but before I do that, could we give a big hand to the two speakers?
Yes.
I think you've been really insightful, thought-provoking. I think it's really, really interesting, and you're so innovative in this space. You've tried things other people haven't tried, and we know that lots of other people are going to be advancing in these directions. One particular thing for me was the way in which we've had the basis of people working together in the first place in Cork to enable the link in with. There's a coherence in what you're doing through the research, through MaREI. And I think that makes a big difference, because a lot of other initiatives, if they're not fun, so it's not Brian, it's Brian and a whole group of other people, but operating coherently in the first place. And that's a challenge in higher education as well. There's challenges on both sides. I just thought it was really, really, really useful and really, really interesting, and really appreciate your time. So I wanted to say particular thanks actually to Anne Hamilton-Black, who's there, and to Ora Dunn, who helps in organising. These guys enable us to do this in the hybrid fashion. And actually there's quite a lot of comments online thanking about the hybrid fashion. And that means that we can have a certain number in the room, but actually we have more than 40 online, and also it'll be up in a couple of days and lots of other people can look at it. So it becomes a continuously available resource. I think that's really, really helpful. So thanks to you and to your colleague Orla. We will be back again here on the 20th of November. Anne has put that up into the comments. We have a session with Nicola Montford here from the School of Business, Avril Keenan in Health Research, Charities Ireland, and Anne Cody in the HRB, and just about them working together on particular aspects, which will be very interesting. Also, jointly with the Department of Further and Higher Education and with UCD, we've been organising a conference on the 11th of November. It's limited attendance in person, but there will be lots of attendance online facilitated by Anne. It's quite a big event, and we're looking forward to that, and it should be really good. And we're about to get in touch in the next few weeks about a programme of seminars for spring. And as I mentioned, Dennis will be part of that. Aoife McGlysett will also be here for a session as well. So we're going to have an interesting series of seminars then. So listen, thanks to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. For a meanwhile, thank you.